The bank statement trembled in my hands as I sat in my hospital bed, the numbers blurring through my tears. 73 years of saving, of sacrificing, of putting everyone else first, gone. And my own son had been the one to take it all while I lay unconscious, fighting for my life after my heart attack. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The worst part, he thought I'd never wake up to find out. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed overhead as I stared at the banking documents spread across my lap like pieces of a broken puzzle. Each transaction told a story I never wanted to read. Each withdrawal felt like another knife twisting in my chest, and not from the triple bypass I'd just survived. "Miss Patterson, you really should be resting," Nurse Jennifer said softly as she checked my IV drip. She'd been the kind one, the one who'd held my hand when the doctor said it was touch and go for 3 days. "I'll rest when I'm dead," I whispered, my voice still hoarse from the breathing tube they'd only removed yesterday. Which, apparently, my son was hoping would happen sooner rather than later. Her eyes widened as she glanced at the papers. She'd seen enough family drama in her 20 years of nursing to recognize the signs. I held up one particular statement, the one that showed my savings account balance going from $847,000 to $23,000 in just 4 days. 4 days while I was unconscious. 4 days while Marcus thought he was finally getting what he'd always felt was owed to him. 47 years I worked at that insurance company. Started as a secretary when Marcus was just 2 years old. His father ran off, left us with nothing but a pile of bills and broken promises. I worked double shifts, weekends, holidays. I missed his school plays, his baseball games, his graduation, all so I could build something secure, something that would take care of us both. My fingers traced the edge of the transfer receipt. Marcus had been smart about it, I'd give him that. He'd used the power of attorney I'd given him years ago, just in case something ever happened to me. I trusted him completely. After all, he was my son, my only child, my world. Jennifer told me that the doctor said I flatlined my voice and my son barely leave my side. I just smiled while I'm pretending to be okay. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Huh. Oh, I'm sure he was distraught. Probably worried I'd wake up before he could finish cleaning out my accounts. I remembered fragments of those dark days. The beeping machines, the whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Marcus on the phone in the hallway, his voice carrying just enough for me to catch pieces. "No, she's not responsive. Yes, I have all the paperwork. It needs to be done now before..." At the time, I thought he was talking to the doctors, maybe the funeral home, making arrangements just in case. Now I realized he'd been talking to his girlfriend, Stephanie, the one who'd been pressuring him to buy her that house in Scottsdale, the one who'd convinced him that his inheritance was just sitting there, wasted on an old woman who might not even survive the week. "Did anyone else visit while I was unconscious?" I asked Jennifer. "Just your son and his girlfriend. She seemed, very concerned about your well-being." Jennifer's tone suggested she'd had her own suspicions about Stephanie's concern. I nodded slowly. Of course Stephanie had been there, probably making sure Marcus followed through with their plan. I could picture her perfectly, all bleached teeth and designer handbags, whispering sweet poison in my son's ear about how he deserved better, how I was just a burden holding him back from his dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 47 years building a nest egg so Marcus would never have to struggle the way I did. I wanted him to have choices, opportunities, freedom. Instead, I'd raised a man who felt entitled to take what wasn't his, who saw his mother's life savings not as her security, but his delayed inheritance. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened my banking app. The numbers were even worse than the paper statement showed. He'd taken everything: the savings account, the money market fund, even the CD that wasn't supposed to mature for another 2 years. There were penalty fees on top of the withdrawals. 73 years old, and I was essentially broke. But Marcus made one crucial mistake in his planning. He'd underestimated his old mother. He thought I was just another confused elderly woman who'd be too grateful to be alive to ask too many questions. He thought I'd be too weak, too trusting, too dependent on him to fight back. He'd forgotten that I didn't survive 47 years in the cutthroat insurance industry by being weak. He'd forgotten that I raised him as a single mother by being resourceful, determined, and yes, when necessary, ruthless. As I stared at those bank statements, something cold and calculating settled in my chest. It felt familiar, like slipping on an old coat I hadn't worn in years. The same feeling I'd had when I'd fought the company lawyers who tried to deny my pension. The same feeling I'd had when I negotiated Marcus's college tuition down to something I could actually afford. I sat in my bed staring at the papers in my lap, the numbers blurring in and out of focus. My mind raced as the weight of betrayal sunk in. How could he do this to me? I'd spent my whole life providing for him, giving him everything, and this is how he repaid me? By stealing what I had left? I clenched my fist, digging my nails into my palms until the pain broke through the numbness. The anger was there, but it wasn't enough. No, what I needed now was clarity. I closed my eyes, letting the hurt wash over me before pushing it aside. I wasn't going to cry. Not for him. I had something stronger in me. I wasn't helpless. I would fight back. The question wasn't, how did he do this? It was, how was I going to make him pay? He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. I reached for my purse and pulled out a business card I'd kept for nearly 15 years, faded and worn, but still legible. Patricia Hawthorne, private investigator. She'd helped me once before, when I'd suspected my ex-husband was hiding assets during our divorce. She'd been thorough, discreet, and absolutely devastating in court. If Marcus wanted to play games with my money, he was about to discover that his mother had been playing a longer game than he ever imagined. The heart monitor beside my bed beeped steadily as I dialed Patricia's number. My pulse was strong, my mind was clear, and my resolve was absolute. Patricia, this is Dorothy Patterson. I think it's time we had another conversation. Patricia's voice was a lifeline when I called her. I could hear the concern in her tone as soon as she picked up. Dorothy, what's going on? I took a deep breath before speaking, knowing this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Patricia, it's Marcus. He's taken everything. My life savings, the money I worked my whole life to save. He used his power of attorney to drain my accounts. There was a pause on the line. I'm sorry, Dorothy. You've got someone who's on your side, though. Let's make sure we hold him accountable. Her words were a comfort I didn't realize I needed. In that moment, I didn't just hear a professional investigator. I heard a friend, someone who'd seen me through tough times before. I wasn't alone in this. As I waited for Patricia to call me back, my mind drifted to 3 months ago when everything still felt normal, when I still believed my son loved me more than he loved money. It's funny how quickly life can change, how the people you trust most can become strangers wearing familiar faces. I remember that warm afternoon in early September, sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching Mrs. Henderson next door tend to her roses. The late summer sun was filtering through the oak tree I'd planted when Marcus was 12, casting those gentle shadows that made everything feel peaceful. My garden was in full bloom, the tomatoes heavy on the vine, the marigolds bright orange against the green backdrop. I'd always found solace in that garden, in the simple act of nurturing something and watching it grow. Marcus had stopped by that day, which was becoming less frequent, but still felt special when it happened. He'd pulled into my driveway in that new BMW he'd been so proud of, the one I now realize he probably couldn't actually afford. At the time, I just felt happy that my son was doing well for himself. A mother wants to believe her child is thriving, you know? We tell ourselves stories to make sense of the things that don't quite add up. He'd seemed restless that afternoon, pacing around my kitchen while I made his favorite chocolate chip cookies, the same recipe I'd used since he was 7 years old, when baking was about the only way I could get him to sit still long enough for us to have a real conversation. He kept checking his phone, tapping his foot against the linoleum in that way that meant his mind was somewhere else entirely. I should have noticed the way he kept glancing toward my desk in the corner, where I kept my important papers organized in neat folders. Should have caught how his eyes lingered on the filing cabinet, where I stored my financial documents. But mothers see what they want to see, don't they? I saw my son visiting, spending time with his old mother. I didn't see a man casing his target. The cookies were cooling on the rack when he finally brought up what was really on his mind. Not my health, not how I was managing the house, not whether I was lonely. Money. It always came back to money with Marcus, though he had clever ways of disguising it as concern. As he sat at my kitchen table, nibbling on the cookies I'd baked for him, I remember how he kept glancing at my desk. I thought it was just idle curiosity. Now I realize he'd been sizing up my financial documents like a hawk circling its prey. He'd started asking more pointed questions about my retirement plan, about how much I had saved, and whether I had considered what would happen if I were to get sick. It was subtle, but the way he said it, like he was looking out for me, was more about him than it was about me. I didn't know it then, but he was already planning to take everything from me. He felt entitled to it. He saw my savings not as security for me, but as something that should belong to him, the next in line, the only child. And he was getting ready to take it, whether I lived or died. He'd started with small questions about my retirement planning, whether I'd thought about what would happen if I got sick, if I'd considered the benefits of having someone younger help manage my finances, all delivered with the kind of practiced charm he'd learned in his sales job, the same tone he probably used to convince customers they needed insurance policies they couldn't afford. I deflected his questions that day the same way I had for months. Told him I was managing just fine, that I'd worked in insurance long enough to know how to plan for the future. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been watching his behavior change over the past year. The way he'd started asking more pointed questions about my portfolio, as he called it. The way Stephanie had begun making comments about how much my house must be worth, how I was sitting on a gold mine in this neighborhood. I'd noticed other things, too, small things that separately meant nothing, but together painted a picture I didn't want to see. The way he'd offered to help me set up online banking, insisting it would be so much more convenient for someone my age. How he'd suggested I give him power of attorney just as a precaution. The casual way he'd mentioned that Stephanie thought I should move into one of those nice senior communities, or I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a big house. Looking back now, I can see the campaign he'd been waging. Subtle, patient, designed to make me feel like I needed him more than I actually did. Make me grateful for his attention, dependent on his help. Make me feel old. That September afternoon, after he'd eaten half the batch of cookies and made his financial inquiries, he'd hugged me goodbye at the door. I remember thinking how good it felt to have him there, how much I missed the days when he was younger and still seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. I'd stood on that porch and waved as he drove away,
feeling grateful that my son still made time for his mother. I had no idea he was already planning to take everything from me. The weeks that followed brought more visits, more questions, more suggestions about how I should be handling my affairs. Marcus had always been persistent when he wanted something, even as a child. The difference was that back then he was usually asking for toys or permission to stay up late. Now he was after something much more valuable and much more devastating to lose. By October, I'd started feeling uneasy about his sudden interest in my well-being. There's something about a mother's instinct that you can't ignore forever, even when you desperately want to. I found myself being more vague when he asked about my accounts, more protective of the information I'd once shared freely. Part of me felt guilty for not trusting him completely. After all, he was my son, my only family. Who else did I have? But there were moments when I'd catch something in his eyes, a calculation, a coldness that reminded me uncomfortably of his father. The same look Richard used to get when he was planning something selfish, something that would benefit him at everyone's expense. I'd learned to recognize that look during our marriage, learned what it meant when a man started seeing you as an obstacle to what he wanted rather than someone he loved. I should have trusted that instinct, should have known that blood doesn't always protect you from betrayal. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones with the best opportunities to hurt you, because they're the ones you'd never suspect. They know your vulnerabilities, your blind spots, your weaknesses. They know exactly how to break your heart while convincing you it's for your own good. The heart attack came on a Tuesday morning in November, while I was deadheading the last of my chrysanthemums before the first frost. One moment, I was kneeling in my garden, breathing in that crisp autumn air that always reminded me of new beginnings, and the next I was clutching my chest as pain shot down my left arm like lightning. I remember thinking, in that strange clarity that comes with crisis, that this was not how I'd planned to spend my morning. I'd had a whole list of things to accomplish: grocery shopping, a phone call to my insurance agent about renewing my homeowner's policy, maybe lunch with my neighbor Helen if she was feeling up to it. Simple, ordinary plans for what should have been a simple, ordinary day. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and I'd been through childbirth, a hysterectomy, and 47 years of corporate stress headaches. This was different. This felt like my body was betraying me from the inside out, like some vital part of me was simply shutting down without warning. I managed to crawl toward the house, my vision blurring at the edges, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. By some miracle, I'd left my phone on the porch table after checking the weather that morning. My fingers were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911, but somehow I managed to get the call through. The operator's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, asking me questions I could barely process. Address, symptoms, age, medical history, all the clinical details of a life reduced to data points for the emergency response system. The ambulance sirens sounded distant, even though they were blaring next to me. I remember catching glimpses of familiar streets through the back window, seeing my neighborhood from this strange horizontal perspective as we raced towards St. Mary's Hospital. Everything looked different lying down, more vulnerable somehow, like I was seeing my world as I might never see it again. At the hospital, time moved differently. There were bright lights and urgent voices, forms to sign and decisions to make about treatment options. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, explained that I'd need immediate surgery, A triple bypass, he called it, where they'd reroute blood around the blocked arteries that had nearly killed me. The technical terms washed over me like a foreign language, but the message was
Without this surgery, I had days at most. With it, I might have years. I signed the consent forms with a hand that barely felt like my own. Marcus arrived just as they were preparing me for surgery, looking genuinely panicked in a way that made me feel guilty for doubting his love for me. He held my hand as they wheeled me toward the operating room, promising he'd take care of everything while I was recovering. At the time, I thought he meant he'd water my plants and collect my mail. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia took hold was looking up at those harsh hospital ceiling lights and thinking about my garden. Would the chrysanthemums survive the frost without me there to cover them? Would someone remember to bring in the ceramic pots before they cracked in the cold? Such small worries for what might have been my final moments. But sometimes it's the small things that anchor us when everything else is falling apart. When I woke up 3 days later, the world had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. Not just the tubes and monitors, not just the ache in my chest where they'd cracked open my rib cage to save my life. Something fundamental had shifted while I was unconscious, something that had nothing to do with my medical condition and everything to do with trust. The first sign was Marcus's behavior when I finally regained full consciousness. Instead of relief at my recovery, he seemed almost disappointed. When I asked about my mail, my bills, the practical matters of life that needed attention, he was evasive, told me not to worry about such things, that I needed to focus on getting better. He'd handled everything, he said. I shouldn't concern myself with mundane details. But I'd spent too many years managing my own affairs to be comfortable with that kind of vague reassurance. When I asked specifically about my bank statements, about whether my automatic payments had gone through, Marcus became noticeably uncomfortable. He'd fidget with his phone, change the subject, or suddenly remember an urgent call he needed to make in the hallway. It was Nurse Jennifer who finally gave me the banking information I had requested. She'd helped me call the customer service line when Marcus wasn't there, thinking she was doing a kindness for an elderly patient who was worried about her finances. Neither of us expected what we discovered. The first shock was seeing my primary savings account balance. What should have been $847,000 accumulated through decades of careful saving and compound interest now showed $23,000. For a moment, I thought there must be some mistake, some computer error or account mix-up. Banks don't just lose $800,000. Money doesn't simply vanish. But as Jennifer helped me navigate through the transaction history, the truth became horrifically clear. 4 large transfers, all made while I was unconscious, all authorized with the power of attorney I'd given Marcus years earlier. Money moved from my savings to his personal account, then immediately transferred again to accounts I didn't recognize. The dates told the story. He'd started moving my money while the doctors were still unsure whether I'd survived the surgery. I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with my damaged heart. This wasn't a medical crisis anymore. This was a theft so profound, so personal, that it challenged everything I thought I knew about my own son. The child I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, had literally stolen my life's work while I lay dying. But what hurt more than the money was the timing. He hadn't waited to see if I'd recover. He hadn't even waited until I was stable. He'd seen my heart attack not as a tragedy to be endured together, but as an opportunity to be seized quickly before I could interfere with his plans. As I stared at those banking records, feeling the weight of betrayal settle into my bones, along with the physical pain of recovery, something shifted in my chest. Not the surgical site. That was healing as expected. This was something deeper, colder, more permanent. The part of me that had spent 73 years trying to see the best in people, trying to forgive and understand and make excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused. Marcus thought he'd timed this perfectly, thought his old, trusting mother would either die and never know what he'd done, or survive in a weakened state where she'd be too grateful for his care to ask difficult questions. He'd calculated the risks and decided I was worth less alive than I was dead. He was about to learn that he'd miscalculated badly. I may have been lying in a hospital bed, may have been 73 years old with a chest full of surgical staples, but I was far from helpless, and I was nowhere near ready to forgive or forget what my son had stolen from me while I fought for my life. The decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing in my veins. I would not let this stand. I would not be the victim Marcus clearly expected me to be. I'd spent too many years learning how to fight, in boardrooms, in divorce courts, in a world that constantly underestimated women like me. My son was about to discover that his mother had learned some very valuable lessons about justice along the way. The next few days in the hospital passed in a carefully orchestrated performance. When Marcus visited, which he did religiously now that his theft was complete, I played the role he expected me to play, the grateful, weakened mother, overwhelmed by his sudden attentiveness, too fragile to handle complex matters like finances or legal documents. I let him fluff my pillows and adjust my blankets. I smiled weakly when he brought me flowers, cheap carnations from the hospital gift shop, not the roses I'd always preferred. I nodded when he explained how he was taking care of everything at home, how I didn't need to worry about a single thing. All the while, I watched him carefully, cataloging every detail of his behavior, every tell that revealed his guilt. Marcus had always been a terrible liar, even as a child. When he was 8 and broke my favorite vase, he'd gotten that same fidgety energy, the same way of avoiding direct eye contact. Now, at 34, he still couldn't mask his tells when he was being deceptive. He talked too much, filled silences that would have been comfortable before with nervous chatter about my recovery, about how relieved he was that I was going to be okay. But I noticed other things too. The expensive watch he was wearing, one I'd never seen before. The way he kept checking his phone, smiling at messages he didn't share with me. The casual mention of looking at houses with Stephanie, how the market is really competitive right now. All the small details that painted a picture of a man spending money he'd stolen from his mother while she recovered from nearly dying. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been making my own phone calls while he was away. Nurse Jennifer had been wonderfully helpful, thinking she was assisting a confused elderly patient with routine matters. She'd helped me contact my bank, my insurance company, my lawyer's office. Each conversation had been brief, carefully worded, designed to gather information without raising alarms. Patricia Hawthorne had returned my call on Thursday evening, just after visiting hours ended. Her voice was exactly as I remembered, professional, no nonsense, with an underlying warmth that had always made me feel like I was talking to someone who understood the stakes involved. I kept our conversation short and deliberately vague, aware that hospital walls were thin and nurses moved through the halls at unpredictable intervals. But I managed to convey the essential facts: unauthorized access to my accounts, significant financial losses, and a need for discreet investigation. Patricia had listened without interruption, then told me she'd begin preliminary research immediately. She understood the urgency, she said. Time was always a factor in cases like these. After hanging up, I lay in that narrow hospital bed staring at the ceiling tiles and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, that had been my initial reaction. This was something more useful, more dangerous. This was the cold calculation I developed during my years navigating corporate politics, the same strategic thinking that had helped me survive as a single mother in a world designed to defeat women like me. Marcus thought he'd won because he'd gotten access to my money. But money was just one battlefield, and I'd been fighting on multiple fronts longer than he'd been alive. He'd shown his hand too early, been too greedy, too impatient. Those were mistakes I'd learned to recognize and exploit decades ago. When he visited on Friday, bringing more cheap flowers and updates about his house hunting adventures, I let him see exactly what he expected to see. I asked about my medications in a confused, elderly voice. I complained about the hospital food, about how tired I felt, about how overwhelming it all seemed. I even let my voice shake a little when I mentioned being worried about my finances, about whether I'd be able to manage on my own when I got home. Marcus had been so solicitous then, so reassuring. He'd patted my hand and promised he'd take care of everything, told me I didn't need to worry about money or bills or any of those complicated matters. He'd handle it all, he said, just like he'd been handling everything while I was recovering. His voice had that particular tone of false compassion that people use when they're being cruel while convincing themselves they're being kind. What he didn't notice was how I'd positioned my phone to record our conversation, tucked discreetly under the edge of my blanket. He didn't see how I'd been taking notes about his visits, documenting his admissions about managing my affairs, his casual references to having full access to my accounts. He certainly didn't realize that his own words were building a case against him with every visit. By Saturday, Patricia had called back with preliminary findings that confirmed what I already suspected: the timing of the transfers, the amounts involved, the accounts they'd been moved to. Everything pointed to a calculated theft rather than any legitimate financial management. She'd also uncovered some interesting information about Marcus's recent spending patterns and his girlfriend's financial pressures that I filed away for future use. More importantly, she'd explained my legal options. The power of attorney Marcus had used gave him certain rights, but it didn't give him the right to steal from me for his personal benefit. There were specific laws about fiduciary duty, about the responsibilities of someone acting on behalf of an incapacitated person. Marcus had violated those laws in ways that could result in both civil and criminal penalties. But Patricia had also warned me about the challenges ahead. Financial elder abuse cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when family members were involved. Juries tended to assume that children had their parents' best interests at heart, even when evidence suggested otherwise. We'd need to build an airtight case, document everything meticulously, and be prepared for Marcus to claim he'd been acting in my best interests. That's when I'd made my decision about how to handle the coming weeks. I would let Marcus continue to believe he'd gotten away with his theft. I would appear grateful for his help, dependent on his care, too overwhelmed by my medical situation to question his financial management. I would be the perfect victim: confused, trusting, easily manipulated. Meanwhile, I would be documenting everything: every conversation, every inconsistency in his stories, every piece of evidence that demonstrated his guilt and his ongoing deception. I'd built a case so thorough, so damning, that when I finally chose to act, there would be no escape for him. The hospital discharge on Sunday morning was another carefully choreographed performance. I let Marcus help me into his car, leaning heavily on his arm as though I were more fragile than I actually felt. I made small, worried comments about returning home, about how different everything seemed after my time away. I thanked him repeatedly for taking such good care of me, for being such a devoted son. As we drove through my neighborhood toward the house I'd lived in for 32 years, I studied everything with new eyes: the neighbors' homes, the familiar streets, the small details of a life I'd built through decades of hard work and careful planning. Marcus had tried to take that security away from me, had gambled with my future while I fought for my life. But he made one crucial error in his calculations. He assumed that surviving a heart attack would leave me too weak to fight back, too grateful for his attention to question his motives. He'd forgotten that I'd spent most of my adult life being underestimated by people who thought age and gender made me an easy target. As we pulled into my driveway, past the garden where my heart attack had begun just 2 weeks earlier, I felt the familiar sense of determination settling into my bones. The same feeling I'd had when I'd fought the insurance company for my rightful pension. The same resolve that had carried me through raising a child alone, building a career in a male-dominated industry, and surviving a divorce from a man who tried to leave me with nothing. Marcus thought the game was over, that he'd won by taking my money while I was helpless. He had no idea that the game was just beginning and that his mother had been playing it far longer and far more skillfully than he could imagine. The first week back home revealed just how confident Marcus had become in his victory. He'd grown comfortable with his deception, almost careless in the way he flaunted his newfound wealth. When he stopped by to check on me that Wednesday afternoon, he was wearing a designer suit I'd never seen before, something that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothes in an entire year. I complimented him on how successful he looked, playing the proud mother, admiring his apparent prosperity. He'd smiled that practiced smile of his and made some vague comment about a work bonus, about how things are really turning around for him professionally. All the while, I was calculating the cost of that suit, that new watch, the luxury car lease he'd mentioned in passing. The math didn't add up to any legitimate income source, but it aligned perfectly with my missing $800,000. What struck me most was how entitled he'd become. There was no shame in his demeanor, no guilt about what he'd done. If anything, he seemed to believe he'd earned this windfall somehow, that taking my life savings while I was unconscious was simply collecting what had always been rightfully his. The casual way he talked about his future plans, the house he was buying, the vacation he was planning with Stephanie, suggested a man who'd completely justified his actions to himself. During that visit, I played my part perfectly. I'd asked him to help me understand my bank statements, which had arrived in the mail that morning. I'd held them up with shaking hands, pointing to the transactions I didn't understand, expressing confusion about the large withdrawals that had occurred while I was hospitalized. My performance was Oscar-worthy. The bewildered elderly woman, overwhelmed by financial complexity, grateful to have such a caring son to explain these confusing matters. Marcus had handled my questions with practiced patience, the same tone you might use with a confused child. He'd explained that there had been some portfolio restructuring to ensure my money was better protected for the future, some complicated investment strategy that I shouldn't worry about because it was too complex for someone in my condition to understand. He'd use just enough financial jargon to make it sound legitimate, while being vague enough to avoid specific lies he might later be held accountable for. What he didn't know was that I had been recording every word of that conversation using the small digital recorder Patricia had recommended. The device was barely larger than a thumb drive, easy to conceal in my cardigan pocket. Every condescending explanation, every patronizing reassurance, every calculated lie was being documented for future use. But the recording was just one piece of evidence I was gathering. During the hours when Marcus wasn't there, when he thought I was napping or watching television, I was methodically building my case. I'd contacted my former colleagues at the insurance company, people who understood financial fraud and knew how to document it properly. I'd reached out to my banker, establishing a timeline of my normal financial behavior versus the suspicious activity that had occurred during my hospitalization. Most importantly, I'd been researching Marcus's recent activities. Patricia's investigation had uncovered a paper trail of luxury purchases, all made within days of my money being transferred from his account. The timing was damning. Luxury jewelry, designer clothes, a substantial down payment on that house in Scottsdale. Every purchase was another nail in the coffin of his defense that he'd been acting in my best interests. Hunting adventures. She'd described their new home with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never had to work for anything herself. The granite countertops, the swimming pool, the walk-in closets that were bigger than some people's bedrooms. She'd even made a comment about how nice it would be to have space for me to visit, maybe even a guest suite where I could stay when I got too old to manage on my own. What he couldn't see was how this apparent defeat was actually advancing my true strategy. Every condescending explanation, every patronizing reassurance, every moment of his obvious relief at avoiding criminal charges was being documented and analyzed. He'd revealed his legal strategy, demonstrated his lack of genuine remorse, and most importantly, he'd grown even more confident in his ability to manipulate me. That confidence would be his downfall, because Marcus had made the same mistake that many people made when dealing with elderly women. He'd confused tactical retreat with strategic defeat. He thought that my inability to secure criminal charges meant I was powerless to seek any form of justice. He'd forgotten that the legal system offered multiple paths to accountability, and that civil courts operated under different standards than criminal ones. While Marcus was celebrating his narrow escape from criminal prosecution, I was already implementing the next phase of my plan. The civil lawsuit Patricia was preparing wouldn't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, just a preponderance of evidence that Marcus had violated his fiduciary duty and stolen from me. The standards were lower, but the potential consequences were actually higher, because civil courts could order full restitution plus punitive damages. More importantly, the civil case would be heard by a jury of my peers, people who understood the vulnerability of elderly Americans and the particular cruelty of family members who exploited that vulnerability. The emotional impact of an elderly woman seeking justice from her own son would be far more powerful in a civil context than it would have been in criminal court. But even the civil case was just one component of a larger strategy that Marcus couldn't yet see. The real battle would be fought on multiple fronts simultaneously: legal, financial, social, and emotional. I'd learned during my corporate career that the most effective strategies were the ones your opponents never saw coming, the ones that seemed like separate, unrelated problems until they converged into an insurmountable crisis. As Marcus left my house that evening, Practically whistling with relief at his apparent victory, I felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. He thought he'd won because he had avoided immediate criminal consequences. He had no idea that his real troubles were just beginning or that his elderly mother had spent decades learning how to fight battles on terrains he didn't even know existed. The morning after Marcus's victory celebration, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a manila folder I'd kept hidden in my bedroom closet since my divorce 15 years ago. Inside were documents that Marcus had never seen, resources he never suspected I possessed, and connections he couldn't have imagined his elderly mother still maintained. The first document was a copy of a trust agreement I'd established in 2019, just after my retirement. Marcus knew I had some retirement savings, but he had no idea about the structure I'd put in place to protect those assets. The trust had been Patricia's suggestion during one of our periodic check-ins about estate planning. She'd seen too many elderly clients victimized by family members to recommend anything less than ironclad protection. What made this trust particularly powerful was its specific provisions for financial abuse. If I ever became incapacitated and someone misused their authority over my finances, the trust included mechanisms for immediate asset protection and legal recourse. More importantly, it named trustees who were legally bound to act in my interests, not in the interests of family members who might have conflicting motivations. The trustees were people Marcus had never met, but who knew me well from my corporate days. Former colleagues who understood both my character and my capabilities. Sarah Chen, who'd been the company's chief financial officer when I retired, and Michael Rodriguez, the former general counsel who'd helped me navigate several complex legal disputes during my career. Both were retired now, but both had maintained their professional networks and their willingness to help a former colleague who'd earned their respect. Patricia had contacted both of them immediately after the criminal case was declined, not to ask for help, but to inform them that the trust's protection mechanisms might need to be activated. Within hours, I'd received calls from both Sarah and Michael, offering not just their professional expertise, but their personal support in dealing with what they correctly identified as a betrayal of the worst kind. Sarah's call had been particularly enlightening. She'd begun her own investigation into Marcus's financial activities using resources and connections that I couldn't access on my own. What she'd discovered was even more damning than what Patricia had uncovered. Marcus hadn't just stolen my money. He'd been systematically accessing my accounts for months before my heart attack, taking smaller amounts that he had apparently hoped I wouldn't notice. The patterns Sarah identified showed a level of premeditation that would be devastating in civil court. Marcus hadn't acted impulsively during my medical crisis. He'd been planning this theft for months, testing my awareness, probing my defenses, waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart attack had simply provided him with the perfect cover for accelerating a plan he'd already been implementing. Michael's contribution was equally valuable, but focused on the legal implications of Marcus's actions. He'd reviewed the power of attorney documents Marcus had used to justify his transfers, and his analysis revealed several critical violations of fiduciary duty that could form the basis for both civil recovery and potential criminal charges under federal law. What Marcus's lawyer, Robert Chen, apparently hadn't considered was that financial crimes involving elderly victims could trigger federal jurisdiction if the amounts were large enough or if electronic transfers crossed state lines. Marcus's movement of my money through multiple accounts, some of which were in different states, had potentially created federal crimes that local prosecutors couldn't decline to pursue. But more than the legal technicalities, Michael had identified something else that would be crucial in the coming confrontation. Marcus's defense strategy, claiming he'd acted to protect me from my own poor judgment, was actually creating additional legal liability. By arguing that he'd moved my money without my consent because I was mentally incompetent, he was admitting to actions that violated both state and federal elder protection laws. As I reviewed these documents and absorbed the implications of what my former colleagues had discovered, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine optimism about the outcome of this battle. Marcus had made his theft possible by underestimating his victim, but he was about to discover that his victim had resources he'd never imagined and allies he never suspected. The third document in my folder was perhaps the most important: a detailed financial audit I'd commissioned 6 months before my heart attack. I'd been concerned about some irregularities in my account activity, small discrepancies that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively suggested someone was testing my awareness of my own finances. The audit was conducted by a forensic accounting firm that specialized in financial fraud, and their report documented every suspicious transaction going back 18 months. What they'd found was a clear pattern of unauthorized access to my accounts, small withdrawals that coincided with periods when Marcus had been helping me with routine financial tasks. The audit report would be devastating evidence in civil court, but it represented something even more valuable: proof that I'd been aware of Marcus's activities long before my heart attack. His lawyer's strategy of portraying me as a confused elderly woman would collapse when faced with evidence that I'd been systematically documenting his theft months before I was hospitalized. The fourth document was one Marcus definitely didn't know existed: a revised will I'd executed just 3 weeks before my heart attack.
The second week brought an even more revealing conversation. Marcus had arrived at my house with Stephanie for the first time since my heart attack, introducing her as though she were meeting me for the first time rather than the woman who'd been pressuring him to steal from me for months. Stephanie was exactly as I'd imagined: all artificial sweetness and predatory calculation. The kind of woman who'd learned to weaponize her charm to get what she wanted from weak men. I'd greeted them both warmly, playing the grateful mother meeting her son's girlfriend. I'd offered them coffee and cookies, made small talk about the weather and my recovery. All the while, I was studying Stephanie's behavior, noting the expensive handbag that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, the diamond earrings that sparkled with what I now knew was my stolen money. The most telling moment came when Stephanie began talking about their heart attack. The timing hadn't been coincidental. It had been a response to my growing suspicions about Marcus's financial behavior and my increasing certainty that he viewed my assets as his inheritance rather than my security. The new will included specific provisions designed to prevent exactly the kind of theft Marcus had committed. It established clear documentation of my mental capacity, included detailed instructions for protecting my assets from family members who might try to exploit any future medical crisis, and named executors who were legally bound to investigate any suspicious financial activity occurring before my death. More importantly, the new will significantly reduced Marcus's inheritance, redirecting the majority of my estate to charitable organizations and educational foundations that reflected my values, rather than his greed. If he'd known about these changes, he might have approached his theft differently. As it was, he'd stolen money from a woman who'd already decided he couldn't be trusted with her legacy.
But the most powerful weapon in my arsenal wasn't any single document. It was the network of professional relationships I'd built over 47 years in the insurance industry. Marcus saw an isolated, elderly woman with limited resources and no powerful allies. What he couldn't see was the web of former colleagues, business contacts, and professional associates who still remembered Dorothy Patterson as someone who'd earned their respect and loyalty. These weren't just character witnesses, they were people with resources, connections, and expertise that could be marshaled in support of justice. When Patricia had reached out to my former network, explaining what Marcus had done, the response had been immediate and unanimous. Nobody who'd known me professionally could believe that I'd consented to the financial arrangements Marcus was claiming. And several had offered to provide expert testimony about my mental acuity and financial sophistication. As I sat in my kitchen that morning, reviewing the resources I'd assembled and the support I'd gathered, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my heart attack. Genuine excitement about a coming battle. Marcus had made his move when he thought his opponent was weakest, but he was about to discover that his opponent had been preparing for this confrontation longer than he'd been planning his theft. The criminal prosecutor's decision had been disappointing, but not unexpected. The civil case would be more promising, but not decisive. The real victory would come from the coordinated campaign I was about to launch. Legal, financial, social, and emotional pressure applied simultaneously from directions Marcus couldn't anticipate or defend against. He'd spent months planning to steal from his mother. I'd spent decades learning how to fight battles against people who underestimated elderly women. The next phase of this conflict would reveal just how thoroughly Marcus had miscalculated the resources and resolve of his intended victim. The confrontation began not with my choice, but with Marcus's growing desperation. 2 weeks after his apparent legal victory, something had shifted in his behavior. The confident swagger was gone, replaced with a nervous energy that reminded me of when he was a child caught in a lie. He'd been calling more frequently, dropping by unannounced, asking pointed questions about my daily activities and who I'd been talking to. What Marcus didn't know was that his world was already beginning to unravel in ways he couldn't see. Sarah's forensic investigation had triggered automatic fraud alerts at several financial institutions, alerts that were now being reviewed by federal banking regulators. Michael's research had resulted in a formal complaint to the state attorney general's office, one that couldn't be dismissed as easily as the local prosecutor had dismissed my initial criminal complaint. But more immediately threatening to Marcus, Patricia had filed the civil lawsuit that would force him to defend his actions in court under oath. The lawsuit wasn't just seeking restitution, it was demanding punitive damages, legal fees, and a full accounting of how my stolen money had been spent. Every luxury purchase he'd made with my money would be scrutinized. Every lie he'd told would be examined. Every moment of his calculated cruelty would be exposed to public judgment. But the lawsuit was just the opening move in a coordinated campaign that would hit Marcus from multiple directions simultaneously. On the same day the civil papers were served, I'd received a call from Agent Susan Martinez at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The federal investigation that Michael had initiated was now active, and Agent Martinez wanted to interview me about the circumstances of my theft. The federal angle changed everything. Marcus's lawyer, Robert Chen, had prepared for a civil case with an elderly victim who might not be credible to a jury. He hadn't prepared for a federal criminal investigation with forensic evidence, expert witnesses, and the kind of resources that could uncover every detail of Marcus's financial crimes. Agent Martinez had been thorough in her preliminary review of the case. And her questions revealed just how much trouble Marcus was actually facing. The federal charges could include wire fraud, elder abuse under federal statutes, and potentially money laundering if the movement of funds was deemed complex enough. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the federal system didn't offer the same plea bargain opportunities as local courts. What struck me most about Agent Martinez was her immediate understanding of the dynamics involved. She'd investigated dozens of elder abuse cases, and she recognized the pattern of Marcus's behavior, the systematic testing of my defenses, the careful timing of his major theft, the calculated use of my medical crisis to cover his crimes. This wasn't a family dispute about financial management. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to exploit an elderly victim's vulnerability. The day I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure came on a cold Tuesday morning in January. Marcus arrived at my house unannounced, clearly agitated, demanding to know what I'd been doing and who I'd been talking to. His facade of caring concern had finally cracked, revealing the entitled, angry man underneath, who'd never accepted that his actions might have consequences. For the first time since discovering his theft, I dropped my own facade. I set down my coffee cup, looked directly into his eyes, and told him that I knew exactly what he'd done and exactly what I was going to do about it. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. The months of pretense were over, and we were finally dealing with the truth of our relationship. Marcus's first reaction was denial, then anger, then a desperate attempt to return to his previous narrative about protecting me from my own poor judgment. But his arguments fell apart when I produced the forensic audit that documented his months of unauthorized access to my accounts. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. He'd been stealing from me long before my heart attack, and my medical crisis had simply provided cover for accelerating his crimes. The revelation that devastated him most was learning about my revised will. Marcus had built his entire financial strategy around the assumption that he would eventually inherit my estate, that any money he stole now was simply an advance on his future inheritance. Discovering that his actions had cost him that inheritance entirely, that his greed had resulted in his disinheritance rather than his enrichment, was a blow he clearly hadn't anticipated. But the cruelest revelation was still to come. As Marcus struggled to process the collapse of his plans, I told him about the phone call I'd received that morning from Agent Martinez. The FBI would be executing search warrants on his home and bank accounts within hours, and he should expect to be arrested and charged with federal crimes that could result in decades in prison. The transformation in Marcus's demeanor was complete and immediate. The arrogant, entitled man who'd been stealing from his mother while she recovered from nearly dying was replaced by a panicked, desperate individual who finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done and what he was about to lose. The expensive clothes, the luxury purchases, the house he'd bought with my money, all of it was about to be seized as evidence of his crimes. What hurt me most wasn't his fear of imprisonment or financial ruin, it was his complete absence of remorse for what he'd done to me. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the certainty of severe consequences, Marcus couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the pain he'd caused or express genuine regret for betraying his mother's trust. His only concern was for himself and his own future, the same selfish perspective that had enabled his theft in the first place. As federal agents arrived at my house that afternoon to formally interview me about the case, I watched through my front window as Marcus's world collapsed with the same systematic precision he'd used to steal from me. The expensive car was towed away as evidence. The house he'd bought with my money was surrounded by investigators documenting his crimes. His girlfriend, Stephanie, faced with the reality of dating a federal criminal, had already distanced herself from the relationship. The poetic justice was perfect in its completeness. Marcus had used my trust and vulnerability to steal from me while I was fighting for my life. Now he was facing the consequences of underestimating the woman he'd tried to victimize, discovering that his elderly mother possessed resources and resolute he'd never imagined. But more than justice, what I felt was a profound sense of vindication. For months, I'd been forced to pretend I was weak when I was actually strong, confused when I was actually calculating, helpless when I was actually preparing for battle. Now the masks were off, and Marcus was finally seeing his mother as she really was. Not a victim to be exploited, but an opponent who'd been playing a longer, more sophisticated game than he'd ever understood. The investigation would continue for months, the legal proceedings would take years, and the emotional healing would take even longer. But the essential battle was over, and the outcome had never really been in doubt. Marcus had chosen to steal from someone who'd spent 73 years learning how to fight for what was hers. He'd finally discovered the cost of that choice, and it was far higher than anything he'd ever imagined. The weeks that followed brought a cascade of consequences that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Marcus's arrest made the local news, local man charged with defrauding elderly mother. And the story resonated with people in ways that went far beyond our family's private tragedy. The comments on the newspaper's website revealed how many other families had experienced similar betrayals, how common it was for adult children to exploit their aging parents' trust and vulnerability. What surprised me most was how quickly Marcus's carefully constructed world disintegrated once the truth was exposed. The house he'd purchased with my stolen money was seized as evidence, forcing him and Stephanie to find emergency housing while awaiting trial. The expensive cars were repossessed when he no longer could make payments without access to my accounts. The designer clothes and luxury accessories that had symbolized his apparent success were revealed as the costumes of a criminal masquerading as a successful man. Stephanie's departure was swift and predictable. Within days of Marcus's arrest, she'd moved out of their temporary apartment and cut all contact with him. The woman who'd pressured him to steal from his dying mother had no interest in supporting him through the consequences of that theft. Her abandonment was perhaps the most fitting consequence of all. Marcus had destroyed his relationship with his mother to please a woman who discarded him the moment he became a liability. The civil lawsuit proceeded with devastating efficiency. Patricia's preparation had been meticulous, and Marcus's defense team found themselves overwhelmed by the evidence we'd assembled. The forensic audit, the recorded conversations, the documented timeline of his theft, everything painted a picture of calculated criminal behavior that was impossible to explain away as protective financial management. The deposition was particularly satisfying. Marcus, under oath and facing perjury charges if he lied, was forced to acknowledge the truth of his actions. He had to admit that he had taken my money without my consent, that he had used it for personal expenses rather than my care, and that he had lied to me repeatedly about what he'd done with my savings, my life savings. Watching him squirm under Patricia's questioning, unable to maintain his facade of concerned devotion, was worth every moment of the pain he'd caused me. But the most powerful moment came when the judge asked Marcus directly whether he understood the impact of his actions on his mother's financial security. For a brief moment, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse cross his face, a flicker of recognition that he'd stolen not just money, but my peace of mind, my sense of security, and my trust in the person I'd loved most in the world. That moment of apparent remorse disappeared quickly, replaced by self-pity and blame-shifting that had characterized his behavior throughout the legal proceedings. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Marcus continued to portray himself as the real victim, a misunderstood son being persecuted by an ungrateful mother and an overzealous legal system. The financial recovery exceeded even Patricia's optimistic projections. The court ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, plus punitive damages that reflected the particularly cruel nature of Marcus's theft from an elderly, hospitalized victim. Additional penalties covered my legal fees, the cost of the forensic investigation, and compensation for the emotional stress he'd caused me. When combined with the seizure of assets he'd purchased with my money, I would recover more than I'd lost to his theft. But beyond the financial recovery was something more valuable: the complete vindication of my decision to fight back. Every person who'd suggested I should forgive Marcus, every family friend who'd implied that I was being too harsh on my own son, every voice that had counseled mercy and understanding was silenced by the overwhelming evidence of his calculated cruelty. The federal criminal case brought even more severe consequences. Marcus's guilty plea to elder fraud and wire fraud charges resulted in a 4-year federal prison sentence, a substantial fine, and a requirement that he pay full restitution even after serving his time. The federal conviction also meant he would face significant challenges finding employment in his previous field, effectively destroying the career he tried to advance through stealing from me. What struck me most during the sentencing hearing was the judge's comments about the case. She spoke about the particular cruelty of crimes committed against elderly victims, the betrayal of trust that occurred when family members exploited their parents' vulnerability, and the importance of sending a clear message that such behavior would face severe consequences. Her words validated everything I'd felt during those dark weeks when I'd wondered if I was overreacting to Marcus's theft. The most satisfying revelation came during the asset seizure process, when investigators uncovered the full extent of Marcus and Stephanie's spending spree. They'd blown through nearly $600,000 in less than 3 months on luxury vacations, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and a lifestyle that was completely unsustainable without continued access to my money. Their plan had apparently been to spend as much as possible quickly before I recovered enough to notice what they'd done. The irony was perfect. Marcus had destroyed his relationship with his mother, his freedom, his career, and his financial future for 3 months of artificial luxury funded by stolen money. The house, the cars, the clothes, the jewelry, all of it was gone, seized by federal agents and sold to compensate his victim. He traded everything that mattered for possessions that never belonged to him in the first place. But the most emotionally satisfying moment came not in any courtroom, but during a quiet conversation I had with Agent Martinez after Marcus's sentencing. She told me that my case had become a model for how elderly victims could effectively fight back against financial abuse, and that the tactics we'd used were being studied and replicated in similar investigations across the country. The idea that my struggle might help other elderly victims find justice against their own exploitative family members gave meaning to the pain Marcus had caused me. Every recorded conversation, every piece of documented evidence, every strategic decision I had made in building my case could now serve as a template for other victims who'd been told they were too old, too confused, or too trusting to seek justice against their abusers. As I sat in my kitchen that evening after Marcus's sentencing, surrounded by the recovered financial documents that represented my restored security, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my heart attack: genuine peace. Not just relief at recovering my money, not just satisfaction at seeing Marcus face consequences for his actions, but the deep contentment that comes from knowing you fought for yourself and won decisively against anyone who underestimated you. The game he thought he was winning? Over from the moment he chose to steal from someone who'd spent decades learning how to turn apparent weakness into devastating strength. This morning, exactly 1 year after my heart attack, I'm sitting in my garden again, the same spot where this whole ordeal began, where I collapsed among the chrysanthemums while Marcus was probably already planning how to spend my money. But everything is different now: the garden, the house, and most importantly, me. The flowers I planted last spring are in full bloom, more vibrant than I remember them being in years. Maybe it's because I'm seeing them through different eyes, eyes that have learned to appreciate what I have instead of grieving what I've lost. Or maybe it's because I finally have the peace of mind to really notice the beauty that was always here, waiting for me to be present enough to see it. The house feels different too, not just because it's secure again, though having my financial stability restored certainly helps me sleep better at night. It's more than that. This place used to feel like a fortress I was defending alone against the world. Now it feels like a sanctuary I've rightfully reclaimed, a home that truly belongs to me because I fought to keep it. People often ask me if I regret what happened, if I wish things could have been different with Marcus. The answer is complicated, but ultimately, no. What my son did to me was unconscionable, but it also revealed truths that I needed to face about him, about our relationship, and most importantly, about myself. For years, I'd been defining myself by my role as a mother, measuring my worth by Marcus's success and happiness. I'd convinced myself that my purpose was to provide for him, to smooth his path, to be the safety net that would catch him whenever he fell. What I hadn't recognized was how that dynamic had made him weak and entitled while making me feel invisible and unimportant in my own life. Marcus's theft forced me to rediscover who Dorothy Patterson was beyond being someone's mother. I found a woman with resources I'd forgotten I had, allies I didn't know I could still count on, and strength that age and illness had hidden but not diminished. The woman who'd fought for herself in boardrooms and divorce courts was still there, just waiting for a worthy battle to bring her back to life. The legal victory was satisfying, but the personal victory was transformative. I learned that being 73 doesn't mean being helpless, that surviving a heart attack doesn't make you fragile, and that being kind doesn't require being naive. I discovered that the skills I developed over decades of working and surviving and raising a child alone were still sharp, still effective, still capable of protecting me when protection was needed. But beyond what I learned about myself, this experience taught me something profound about trust and betrayal. When someone you love betrays you, especially someone you've sacrificed everything for, the temptation is to become bitter, to close your heart to prevent future hurt. What I learned instead was that the betrayal said nothing about my worthiness of love and everything about the betrayer's capacity for it. Marcus's actions didn't diminish the years of good mothering I'd given him. They didn't invalidate the sacrifices I'd made or the love I'd offered. They simply revealed that he'd chosen to value money more than integrity, immediate gratification more than lasting relationships, and his own comfort more than his mother's security. Those were his choices, his failures, his losses to bear. The hardest lesson was learning to forgive myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for trusting someone who'd been demonstrating his untrustworthiness for months before my heart attack. But self-forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about pretending you didn't make mistakes. It's about recognizing that acting from love and trust, even when those impulses are betrayed, is never the wrong choice. The error wasn't in trusting my son, it was in ignoring the evidence that my trust was misplaced. Today, I have relationships I'd forgotten were possible. Sarah and Michael, my former colleagues who rallied to support me during the legal battle, have become genuine friends again. We have lunch monthly, share books and ideas, and remind each other that retirement doesn't mean irrelevance. Patricia has become more than my investigator and lawyer. She's become a trusted advisor and confidant who helps me navigate the complexities of rebuilding my life. I've also connected with other elderly victims of financial abuse through support groups Patricia recommended. Sharing our stories, Comparing our strategies and celebrating each other's victories has created a sense of community I hadn't realized I was missing. There's power in knowing you're not alone in your struggles, and there's healing in helping others find their own path to justice and recovery. But perhaps the most meaningful change is in how I see my future. Before Marcus's theft, I was living cautiously, managing my resources carefully, planning for a gradual decline toward dependency and eventual need for care. That mindset made me an easy target because it positioned me as someone whose best years were behind her, someone whose primary value was as a financial resource for others. Now I'm planning differently. I'm traveling, not extravagantly, but purposefully, visiting places I'd always wanted to see, but had postponed for someday. I'm learning new things, taking classes at the community college, exploring interests I'd set aside during my working years. I'm investing in experiences and relationships rather than just preserving assets for an inheritance that may never be deserved or appreciated. Most importantly, I'm using my voice in ways I never had before. I speak at community centers about financial fraud prevention, share my story with other elderly people who might be facing similar betrayals, and advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. The platform I gained through surviving Marcus's theft has become a tool for helping others avoid or overcome similar experiences. The woman who couldn't prevent her son from stealing her life savings has become someone who helps other potential victims recognize the warning signs and fight back effectively. The mother who was betrayed by the person she trusted most has become an advocate who shows other elderly people they don't have to accept abuse silently. The victim has become a victor, and the victor has become a voice for others who are still finding their strength. This morning, as I tend to flowers that survived the winter and bloomed more beautifully than ever before, I think about resilience. Not just human resilience, but the deeper truth that sometimes being broken open is what allows the light to get in. Marcus's theft broke something in me that needed breaking. My willingness to be invisible, to accept less than I deserved, to define my worth by someone else's choices. What grew in that broken place was stronger and more beautiful than what was there before. A woman who knows her own value, trusts her own judgment, and isn't afraid to fight for what belongs to her. A person who's learned that age is not weakness, kindness is not stupidity, and love doesn't require martyrdom. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in it, if you're being taken advantage of by someone you love, if you're being told you're too old or too confused or too dependent to stand up for yourself, please know that you're stronger than you think. You have more resources than you realize. You deserve better than you're accepting. And it's never too late to reclaim your power and protect what's rightfully yours. The heart that nearly stopped beating in this garden a year ago is stronger now, not just physically, but spiritually. It beats for a woman who's learned that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about living fully, loving wisely, and never, ever giving up the fight for your own dignity and worth. And that's a lesson worth any price I paid to learn it.